The diplomatic station floated in neutral space, far from any star system. Its metal hull reflected the distant galaxies, making it look like a jewel suspended in darkness. Inside, the main council chamber buzzed with activity. Representatives from 12 different alien species had gathered for an emergency meeting. And the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Commander Jake Morrison stood near the entrance with his team. He wore his dress uniform, crisp and decorated with medals that caught the light. His officers flanked him on both sides, all of them looking sharp and professional. They were the human delegation, and every eye in the room was on them. The Vryn were particularly focused on Morrison. These reptilian aliens stood nearly 7 feet tall, with scales that shifted between green and black. Their ambassador, a massive creature named Vex, had been arguing for the past hour about the human problem. According to him, humanity was expanding too fast, taking resources that belonged to older civilizations and generally being a nuisance to the established order of the galaxy. Morrison listened patiently, his face calm. He had dealt with this kind of posturing before. The Vryn liked to make noise, to intimidate, to dominate conversations. But underneath all the bluster, they were usually open to negotiation. At least that was what Morrison hoped. While the politicians argued, a man in a gray jumpsuit moved quietly along the upper walkway. Danny Cole carried a toolbox and a diagnostic pad. He was checking the environmental systems, or at least that was what anyone who bothered to look would think. In reality, only a handful of people even noticed him at all. He was just maintenance staff, someone who fixed things when they broke. Not worth paying attention to. Danny preferred it that way. He had spent the last 5 years perfecting the art of being invisible. Not literally invisible, of course, but invisible in the way that mattered. People looked right through him. Their eyes would pass over him without registering that anyone important was there. It was a skill that had taken years to develop, and it was the most valuable weapon in his arsenal. He adjusted a panel on the wall, his fingers moving with practiced ease. To anyone watching, he was simply doing his job. What they could not see was the small device he had just attached to the communication relay. It was no bigger than a fingernail, and it would record every signal that passed through this section of the station. The data would be invaluable. Back on the main floor, Vex slammed his clawed hand against the podium. The sound echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Several of the smaller species representatives jumped in their seats. "Humanity must be contained," Vex declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "They breed like insects. They consume resources without regard for others. And they are unpredictable, dangerous. We have all seen how quickly they adapt, how ruthlessly they pursue their interests." Morrison stepped forward, raising his hand politely. "If I may respond to these allegations." The council moderator, a thin, blue-skinned being called a Quellan, nodded permission. The Quellans were known for their strict neutrality, which made them perfect administrators for diplomatic stations like this one. "The Vryn representative paints humanity as some kind of plague," Morrison said, his tone measured and calm. "But let us look at the facts. Yes, we have established colonies on 17 worlds in the past decade, but all of these worlds were uninhabited. We have not displaced anyone. We have not taken resources that belong to others. We have simply done what any growing civilization does. We have expanded into empty space." Vex hissed, a sound that was distinctly unfriendly. "Empty space that we were planning to use. You rush ahead without consulting the council, without respecting the territorial claims of established powers." "Territorial claims to systems you have never visited," Morrison countered. "The galaxy is vast. There is room for everyone." Danny continued his slow circuit of the chamber. He had moved to the lower level now, near where the Vryn delegation sat. He knelt beside an access panel, ostensibly checking the power conduits. In reality, he was close enough to hear their whispered conversations. 2 of the Vryn officers were speaking in their native language. They thought no one nearby could understand them. They were wrong. Danny had spent 6 months learning Vryn speech patterns. His translation implant, hidden behind his ear, helped with the more complex phrases. "The fleet is in position," one of them said quietly, "just beyond the neutral zone boundary. The commander believes the council will fold once they realize we have overwhelming force nearby." The other one made a clicking sound of approval. "The humans have no idea. They think this is just talk. But when Vex gives the signal, they will see how serious we are." Danny filed this information away. A Vrin fleet positioned just outside the neutral zone. That was a direct violation of Council protocols. It was also a major threat. If the Vrin decided to use that fleet, this diplomatic meeting could turn into a bloodbath very quickly. He stood up slowly, closing the access panel. He made eye contact with Morrison for just a fraction of a second. It was the briefest of glances, the kind that could easily be mistaken for a servant looking at his superior. But Morrison saw it. He understood. The message was clear: complications ahead. The debate continued for another hour. Other species added their concerns about human expansion. Some were genuine worries about resource competition. Others were clearly coached, repeating talking points that sounded suspiciously similar to Vrin arguments. Danny noted which species seemed to be coordinating with the Vrin. It was useful information. As the session finally broke for a recess, Danny made his way toward the service corridors. These narrow passages ran throughout the station, allowing maintenance workers to move between sections without getting in the way of the important people. It was a whole hidden network that the diplomats barely knew existed. He passed two other maintenance workers, both aliens, in the corridor. They nodded to him in that universal way that service workers acknowledged each other. Fellow members of the invisible class, people who kept the station running while others took credit for everything. Danny reached his quarters, a small room with a bed, a desk, and basic amenities. It was all he needed. He pulled out a secure communicator and began encoding his report. The information about the Vrin fleet needed to reach Earth intelligence immediately. But he had to be careful. If anyone detected his transmission, his cover would be blown. As he worked, Danny thought about how different his life was from what people expected. When he was younger, he had imagined being a spy would mean car chases and shootouts, dramatic confrontations, and narrow escapes. The reality was much more mundane. It meant fixing air filters while eavesdropping on conversations. It meant being so boring that people forgot you existed. It meant patience, discipline, and the willingness to let others take the glory. But it also meant being effective in ways that traditional spies could never match. Because everyone expected spies to be charming and clever, to be James Bond figures who seduced informants and cracked safes. No one expected the maintenance guy. No one watched him carefully or guarded their words around him. He was just part of the background, like the walls or the floor. That was his power. That was what made him dangerous. Danny finished his report and sent it through a secure channel that bounced the signal off 3 different relay stations before reaching Earth. By the time anyone could trace it, the trail would be so cold it was useless. He lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring more work, more eavesdropping, more careful positioning. The Vrin thought they were in control. They thought their fleet gave them all the leverage they needed. They had no idea that the most dangerous human on this station was not the decorated commander in his fancy uniform. It was the quiet man in the gray jumpsuit who no one ever seemed to notice, and that was exactly how Danny wanted it. 20 years before Danny Cole stood in that council chamber, humanity had learned a very expensive lesson about galactic politics. It happened during Earth's first major diplomatic mission to the Karathi Empire, one of the oldest and most sophisticated civilizations in known space. Earth had sent its best people. Brilliant negotiators, experts in game theory and psychology, backed by military advisors who understood strategy better than anyone alive. They had prepared for months, wargaming every possible scenario. They were confident, maybe even a little arrogant. After all, humanity had survived and thrived against incredible odds. How hard could one diplomatic mission be? The answer turned out to be very hard indeed. The Karathi had read every move before the humans made it. Every negotiating position was countered perfectly. Every bluff was called. Every secret the human delegation tried to keep was somehow already known. By the end of the 3-week mission, Earth had signed a trade agreement that heavily favored the Karathi and included restrictions that would limit human expansion for the next 50 years. The human delegation returned home confused and frustrated. They had been outplayed completely, but they could not figure out how. The Karathi did not have telepaths. They did not have time travel. They were simply better at reading people, or so everyone thought. It took 3 years of investigation to figure out what had really happened. A junior analyst named Lisa Hayes finally cracked it. She noticed something odd in the security footage from the Karathi meetings. The cameras showed human delegates talking, arguing, making decisions. But they also showed something else. They showed the support staff, the people who brought water and managed equipment and cleaned the rooms. And those people were always watching. The Karathi had not been reading the diplomats better than anyone else could. They had been watching everyone else around the diplomats. The secretaries who tensed when certain topics came up. The technical advisors whose eyes shifted when someone bluffed. The security guards who relaxed when their side gained an advantage. All the people who were in the room but not part of the main conversation. All the people the human delegation had forgotten to coach on keeping poker faces. It was brilliant in its simplicity. Everyone focused on the main players and forgot about the supporting cast. But the supporting cast gave away everything through unconscious body language and micro-expressions. Lisa Hayes presented her findings to military intelligence. Most of the officers wanted to implement better training for support staff, teach them to control their reactions. But Hayes proposed something different, something radical. They expect us to have support staff, she said. They expect us to have maintenance workers and secretaries and all the people who keep operations running. So we give them that. But what if our support staff was not really support staff? What if they were our actual intelligence operatives? The idea met resistance at first. Intelligence work was supposed to be glamorous or at least respectable. The idea of having trained agents pretend to be janitors seemed insulting. But Hayes was persistent. She ran simulations. She demonstrated how much access a maintenance worker had compared to a traditional spy. She showed how people talked freely around service staff, revealing secrets they would never share with someone they knew was listening. Eventually, she got approval for a pilot program. They called it Gray Man Protocol, named after an old concept in covert operations. The Gray Man was someone who blended in so perfectly that they became functionally invisible. Not the most attractive person in the room or the most unattractive. Not the loudest or the quietest. Just perfectly average, perfectly forgettable. Hayes spent a year developing the training program. It was not about learning how to fight or hack computers, though those skills were included. It was about learning how to be boring, how to be the person people looked past, how to move through a space without drawing attention, how to be present but not noticed. She recruited carefully. Traditional intelligence officers were often too confident, too charismatic. She needed people who could suppress their egos, who did not need recognition or glory. She found them in unusual places. Special Forces soldiers who preferred reconnaissance to combat, analysts who were brilliant but socially awkward, technical specialists who were happy to be left alone with their work. Danny Cole came to her attention through a recommendation from a special operations commander. The commander described an incident during a hostage rescue mission. Danny had been part of the team, but during the operation he had separated from the group. He had simply walked into the building through the front door, wearing civilian clothes he had found somewhere. He moved through the hostile facility for 40 minutes, gathering intelligence and positioning equipment before rejoining his team. Multiple enemy fighters had seen him and dismissed him as unimportant. Hayes interviewed Danny personally. He was medium height, medium build, with a face that was pleasant but unremarkable. Brown hair, brown eyes, no distinguishing features. When she asked him how he had managed to walk through an enemy stronghold unnoticed, he had shrugged. "I just tried to look like I belonged there," he said. "People see what they expect to see. If you act like you are supposed to be somewhere, most people do not question it." That was exactly what Hayes was looking for. She recruited Danny immediately and put him through an intensive 6-month training program. He learned languages, cultural practices, technical skills for various cover jobs. But more importantly, he learned how to be nobody special, how to enter a room and have people forget he was there 5 minutes later, how to be so thoroughly uninteresting that minds simply slid past him. Danny took to it naturally. He discovered that he actually enjoyed the work. There was a kind of freedom in invisibility. When no one was watching you, you could observe everything. When no one thought you mattered, they revealed their true selves around you. His first real mission was on a trading station in neutral space. His cover was as a cargo handler, loading and unloading freight. His real job was to identify which alien species were smuggling weapons to a pirate group that had been raiding human colonies. He spent 3 months on that station, working 12-hour shifts, living in cramped quarters with other workers. He was so perfectly mundane that even his fellow workers struggled to remember his name. But during those 3 months, he mapped the entire smuggling operation. He identified the suppliers, the transportation network, the buyers. When human forces finally moved to shut it down, they rolled up the entire organization in a single coordinated strike. Hundreds of lives were saved because Danny had spent 3 months being boring. That success led to more missions. Danny operated on 17 different stations and planets over the next 5 years. He worked as a maintenance technician, a food service worker, an administrative assistant, a cleaning crew member. Each time he was invisible. Each time he was deadly effective. Other operatives in the Gray Man program had similar success. Hayes expanded the operation, recruiting and training more agents. They became Earth's secret advantage in galactic politics. While other species focused on the obvious players, humans had eyes and ears everywhere, hidden among the people no one bothered to notice. The program had rules, of course. The most important rule was that Gray Man operatives could never take credit for their work. If people knew about them, if they became famous or recognized, they lost their power. So when missions succeeded, other people got the medals. Diplomats got praised for negotiations that were won by intelligence gathered from janitors. Military commanders got credit for victories enabled by information from food service workers. Some operatives struggled with that. They wanted recognition, wanted people to know how important they were. Those operatives did not last long in the program. But others, like Danny, found satisfaction in the work itself. They did not need people to know what they had accomplished. They knew, and that was enough. By the time Danny arrived at the diplomatic station to face the Vryn, he was the most experienced Gray Man operative in the program. He had been in more dangerous situations than he could count. He had prevented wars, exposed conspiracies, and saved countless lives, and almost no one in the galaxy knew his name or face. That anonymity was about to become humanity's greatest asset, because the Vryn were planning something big, something that could threaten Earth's place in the galactic community. And they had no idea that the maintenance man checking their air filters was the most dangerous human on the station. Lisa Hayes, now a colonel, had briefed Danny personally before this mission. She had looked him in the eye and told him how critical this was. The Vryn were not just posturing. They were building a coalition against humanity, manufacturing evidence to make Earth look aggressive and dangerous. If they succeeded, humanity could face isolation or even military action from multiple species at once. "I need you to find out what they are really planning," Hayes had said. "And I need you to stop it. But you have to do it without anyone knowing we were involved. No fingerprints, no traces. Just make it happen." Danny had nodded. It was the kind of impossible task he specialized in, the kind of mission that required patience, precision, and the willingness to work in shadows while others stood in spotlight. He thought about. Danny woke before the station's artificial dawn. His internal clock was precise after years of field work. He showered, dressed in his maintenance jumpsuit, and headed to the service cafeteria. This was where the support staff ate, separate from the diplomatic dining areas where the important people had their meals. The cafeteria was busy with workers from a dozen species, all of them preparing for their shifts. Danny grabbed a tray of the standard human breakfast rations and sat at a corner table. He ate slowly, listening to conversations around him. Most of it was mundane gossip, complaints about difficult assignments or annoying supervisors. But occasionally, useful information slipped out. A Tlaxian cleaner was talking about how the ambassadors from his species had been in a private meeting until very late last night. That was interesting. The Tlaxians had been neutral up to this point. A late-night meeting suggested they might be choosing sides. Danny finished his meal and checked his work assignment on the communal terminal. Today he was scheduled to perform environmental system maintenance in the guest quarters section. Perfect. That was where all the visiting delegations stayed, including the Vryn. He collected his tools and headed to the first assigned location. The work was real, not just a cover. The station's environmental systems needed constant attention to keep the atmosphere comfortable for so many different species. Danny actually had to know what he was doing, which was why all Gray Man operatives received genuine technical training for their covers. His first stop was a Quellan diplomat's quarters. He knocked, announced himself, and was admitted. The Quellan barely glanced at him before returning to his reading. Danny went to work on the air circulation panel, testing flow rates and replacing a worn filter. While he worked, his eyes scanned the room. A data pad lay on the desk, its screen showing what looked like voting records from previous council sessions. Nothing particularly sensitive. The next quarters belonged to one of the smaller species, the Pinari. These insect-like beings were generally friendly toward humans. The Pinari occupant actually spoke to Danny, asking if the temperature could be adjusted slightly warmer. Danny made the adjustment and noted the polite treatment. The Pinari at least saw service workers as actual people rather than furniture. Then came the Vrin quarters. Danny had been looking forward to this. He knocked and waited. The door opened to reveal a junior Vrin officer, one of the ones Danny had overheard talking about the fleet yesterday. "Maintenance," Danny said simply, holding up his identification badge. The Vrin made an annoyed hissing sound but stepped aside. Danny entered, keeping his eyes down in a submissive posture that most dominant species appreciated. The quarters were larger than standard, modified to accommodate the Vrin's size. The temperature was higher too, matching their homeworld's climate. Danny went to the environmental panel and began his diagnostics. The Vrin officer sat at a desk working on something on his computer. He spoke into a communication device in his language, clearly not concerned about the human maintenance worker overhearing. "Yes, the schedule remains unchanged," the Vrin said. "The Admiral confirms the fleet will hold position until the signal is given. The other species are falling in line as predicted. The Tlaxians agreed last night. That gives us 7 species in the coalition." Danny's hands never stopped moving as he listened. 7 species coordinating against humanity. That was worse than intelligence had estimated. He carefully removed a cover panel and examined the circuitry beneath, but his mind was recording every word. "The evidence packets will be distributed tomorrow," the Vrin continued. "Each species will receive documentation showing human aggressive intentions. Once they see the proof, even the neutral parties will have to admit that containment is necessary. Evidence packets. Fabricated proof of human aggression." This was what Hayes had suspected. The Vrin were not just building a coalition through diplomacy. They were manufacturing justification for action against Earth. Danny needed to see that evidence. He needed to know what the Vrin had created and how they planned to distribute it. But that information would not be in these junior quarters. It would be with the senior leadership, probably Ambassador Vex himself. He finished the maintenance work and packed his tools. The Vrin officer never looked at him as he left. Danny was beneath notice exactly as he intended. The rest of the morning was spent on legitimate maintenance tasks. He fixed a stuck door mechanism, recalibrated a water purification system, and replaced lighting elements in a conference room. Each task was performed competently and without fuss. He was building a reputation as a reliable, boring technician who did his job and nothing more. During lunch, Danny returned to the service cafeteria. He sat near a group of communication technicians who maintained the station's data networks. They were discussing the increased traffic over the past few days. Apparently, several delegations were sending and receiving much more data than usual. "The encryption is serious too," one technician said. "Military-grade stuff. Way more than you need for normal diplomatic communications." His colleague nodded. "The Vrin have been running data through the system every night around midnight. Big packets all encrypted. I wonder what they are sending." Danny ate his lunch and absorbed this information. Midnight transmissions. That was when the station had minimal staff, when people were least likely to notice unusual activity. If he could intercept one of those transmissions, he might be able to see what the Vrin were distributing to their coalition partners. But interception would be tricky. The station's communication systems were monitored. Any attempt to tap into the data flow would be noticed unless he could make it look like something else. He needed to think about this carefully. The afternoon brought more maintenance assignments. Danny worked his way through the station, fixing small problems and staying invisible. He passed Commander Morrison in a corridor at one point. They did not acknowledge each other beyond a brief nod, the kind a superior might give to a servant he vaguely recognized. But in that moment of passing, Morrison's hand moved slightly, a gesture that looked casual but contained meaning. 3 fingers extended briefly. Danny understood. Morrison was telling him they had 3 days before something happened, probably an ultimatum or deadline the Vrin had set. 3 days to uncover and expose the conspiracy. It was not much time, but Danny had worked with less before. He spent the last part of his shift in the station's technical areas, the rooms where the actual infrastructure lived. Computer systems, communication relays, power distribution. This was the hidden skeleton of the station. the machinery that made everything work. Very few people came down here except the technical staff. Danny struck up a conversation with one of the senior technicians, a Quellan named Morvis. The Quellans were methodical and precise, which made them excellent at technical work. They also tended to be very rule-focused, which could be either an advantage or a problem depending on the situation. "How long have you been on this station?" Danny asked while they both worked on a power relay. 6 years, Morvis replied. "It is stable work and I appreciate the neutrality. No political complications," Danny nodded. "Must be interesting, though, with all these different species coming through. Do you ever have problems with incompatible systems?" "Sometimes," Morvis admitted. "The Vryn equipment is always a challenge. Their encryption systems do not interface cleanly with our network protocols. We have to route their communications through special nodes to avoid conflicts." Special nodes. That was exactly what Danny needed to know. If the Vryn communications went through dedicated nodes, those nodes could potentially be accessed without triggering general security alerts. He continued the conversation casually, learning more about the station's network architecture. Morvis was happy to talk about his work with someone who showed genuine interest. By the end of their chat, Danny had a clear understanding of how the system worked and where its vulnerabilities might be. That evening, Danny filed his work reports and returned to his quarters. He needed to plan carefully. The Vryn would send their next data packet tonight at midnight. If he could position himself at the right access point, he might be able to capture that data. Not intercept it, which would be noticed, but copy it as it passed through. The trick would be having a legitimate reason to be in the technical areas at midnight. Maintenance workers had scheduled shifts, and Danny's did not include late-night work. He needed to create a reason, something that would not raise suspicion. He spent an hour reviewing the station's systems on his terminal. Then he found it. One of the backup power systems in Section 7 was showing minor inefficiency in its performance logs. Nothing critical, but enough that a conscientious maintenance worker might want to check it out during low-traffic hours to avoid disrupting normal operations. Danny filed a maintenance request for late-night access to Section 7. The request was approved automatically by the system. Quellan administrators loved efficiency and hated disruption. A maintenance worker volunteering to work at night to avoid bothering people was exactly the kind of thing they appreciated. Now he just had to wait. Danny used the time to prepare his equipment. He had several small devices hidden in his quarters, disguised as common tools or personal items. The decryption program ran for most of the night. Danny dozed in his chair, waking every hour to check progress. By morning, the files were unlocked and ready for review. What he found was worse than he had expected. The Vryn had created an entire false history of human aggression. There were fabricated intelligence reports showing Earth planning to seize territory from neighboring species. There were edited communications that made human diplomats sound arrogant and threatening. There were even fake military documents outlining invasion strategies. The work was sophisticated. Someone with access to real human communication protocols had helped create this. The forgeries would fool most analysis, at least initially. By the time anyone proved they were fake, the damage would be done. The coalition would be formed, and humanity would be facing coordinated opposition from 7 different species. Danny copied all the files to a secure storage device, and then completely wiped his terminal. No traces could remain. He needed to think carefully about his next move. The evidence was damning, but only if the right people saw it. If Danny simply handed it to Commander Morrison, the Vryn would claim it was human fabrication. They would say Earth had created fake evidence to discredit them. It would be a stalemate, and the conspiracy would probably continue under deeper cover. No, the evidence had to be discovered independently. It had to appear as though neutral parties had found it through their own means. Only then would it carry enough weight to expose the conspiracy. Danny spent the morning working his regular maintenance rounds while his mind raced through possibilities. He needed a way to make the Vryn evidence surface naturally. He needed someone with authority to stumble across it in a way that could not be questioned. The answer came to him while he was fixing a malfunctioning food dispenser in the service area. The station kept automated backups of all data flowing through its systems. The Quellans, with their obsessive attention to rules and procedures, archived everything. If Danny could make the Vryn transmissions decrypt themselves into those archives, they would be found during routine review. But how could he make military-grade encryption simply fail? The Vryn systems were secure. They would not just break on their own, unless someone made a mistake in the encryption keys, unless the quantum keys that secured the transmissions became corrupted just enough to cause the system to fall back to a lower level of encryption. And if that lower level happened to be something the station's automatic systems could read, well, that would be an unfortunate technical glitch. It was risky. Danny would need to access the Vrin communication equipment directly. He would need to subtly corrupt their quantum key generators in a way that looked like hardware degradation, rather than sabotage. It was technically difficult and personally dangerous, but it would work. The Quellans would find the decrypted files in their routine backup review. They would be obligated by their own protocols to report it to the Council. And the Vrin would have no way to prove human involvement because the failure would be in their own equipment. Danny checked his work schedule. He was not assigned to any Vrin areas today. He would need to create a reason to access their systems. An emergency would work, but engineering an emergency carried risks. Better to use a routine issue that required immediate attention. He made his way to the Environmental Control Center and accessed the monitoring systems. The Vrin quarters showed normal operation, but Danny noticed that the temperature had been gradually increasing over the past few days. The Vrin liked it hot, and they had been adjusting their climate controls incrementally warmer. That gave him an idea. If the cooling system in the Vrin section showed signs of impending failure, maintenance would need to access all the technical spaces in that area to prevent a breakdown. That would include the communication equipment rooms. Danny made a few adjustments to the monitoring software. Nothing dramatic, just subtle changes that made the cooling system appear less efficient than it actually was. According to the monitors, the Vrin section would experience a cooling failure within 36 hours if maintenance did not intervene. He filed a preventive maintenance request and flagged it as moderate priority. The Quellan supervisor reviewed it and approved the work immediately. Preventing failures was exactly the kind of proactive maintenance they appreciated. That afternoon, Danny led a small team into the Vrin section. 2 other technicians came with him, both aliens who had no idea they were part of an intelligence operation. They were just doing their jobs, which made them perfect cover. They worked their way through the environmental systems, and Danny made sure to perform real maintenance while he was there. The cooling issue was genuine, even if he had exaggerated its severity. He replaced components, cleaned filters, and recalibrated sensors. Professional, thorough, boring. But when they reached the communication equipment room, Danny asked the others to focus on the environmental units while he checked the power systems. "I noticed some fluctuation in the logs," he explained. "Probably nothing, but I want to make sure the communication gear is not causing any drain issues." They nodded and continued their work. No one questioned him. Why would they? He was just being thorough. Danny opened the access panel for the Vrin communication system. The quantum key generator was a small, sophisticated device. It created the encryption keys that secured all their transmissions. Tampering with it would normally leave obvious traces, but if he could make it look like simple component degradation, like the kind of failure that happened naturally over time, it might work. He had a small device in his toolkit, disguised as a standard diagnostic tool. It emitted a precise electromagnetic pulse, just enough to damage certain components without leaving burn marks or other obvious signs of sabotage. Danny had used it before on other missions. It was designed specifically for this kind of work. He ran the pulse through the quantum generator for exactly 3 seconds. The device showed no external signs of damage, but internally critical components would now degrade over the next 24 hours. The encryption system would begin producing errors. Eventually, it would fail completely and fall back to standard encryption that the station's systems could read. Danny closed the access panel and rejoined the other technicians. They finished the maintenance work and filed their reports. Everything had gone smoothly. Just another day of keeping the station running, but that evening complications emerged. Danny was in his quarters monitoring the station's systems remotely when he saw an alert. There was a genuine emergency in the reactor section. A cooling pump had failed, and they needed all available maintenance personnel to help with repairs. Danny's heart sank. The reactor was on the opposite side of the station from where he needed to be, and if he did not respond to the emergency call, it would raise questions. Maintenance workers were expected to help during emergencies. He reported to the reactor section along with a dozen other technicians. The lead engineer, a Quellan named Thoris, was directing the operation with typical Quellan efficiency. The cooling pump needed to be replaced, and it was a complex job requiring careful coordination. Danny was assigned to a team working on disconnecting the old pump. It was hot, uncomfortable work in the reactor spaces. The schedule called for at least 2 hours of effort before they could even begin installing the replacement. But in less than 2 hours, the Vryn would transmit their next data packet. The quantum key generator would fail during that transmission, and the files would decrypt into the station's archives. Danny needed to be at a monitoring station to verify that everything worked as planned. If something went wrong, if the failsafe did not trigger correctly, he would need to be able to adjust his approach. He worked as efficiently as possible, trying to speed up the process without being obvious about it. But Thoris ran a tight operation. Everything was done according to procedure, at the proper pace. There was no rushing allowed when working near a reactor. 30 minutes into the job, Danny made a calculated decision. He was holding a container of thermal paste when he deliberately knocked it over. The paste spilled across a control panel, making a mess. "I am so sorry," Danny said, looking genuinely embarrassed. "Let me go get cleaning supplies and more paste from storage." "I will be right back." Thoris looked annoyed but nodded. "Be quick about it. We need that panel operational." Danny left at a normal pace, but the moment he was out of sight, he started running. The storage depot was on level 7. The monitoring station he needed was on level 12. He had maybe 15 minutes before someone would notice his absence was taking too long. He took a service ladder, climbing as fast as he could. His legs burned with the effort, but he pushed through. He emerged onto level 12 and made his way to a rarely used equipment room that had access to the monitoring systems. He pulled up the data flow logs and watched. 5 minutes until the scheduled transmission. His breathing was heavy from the climb, but his hands were steady as he worked the controls. The transmission began exactly on schedule. The Vryn sent their encrypted packet through the network. Danny watched as the quantum key generator began to fail exactly as planned. The encryption degraded, falling back to lower and lower levels of security. And then, just as designed, it dropped to a level the station's systems. The emergency council session was called for 10 in the morning. Danny was assigned to maintenance duties in the council chamber, which meant he would be present for the entire proceeding. He arrived early, checking lighting systems and environmental controls. By the time the delegates began arriving, he was up in the technical gallery, practically invisible against the equipment racks. Commander Morrison entered with his team, looking composed but concerned. He had received the emergency notification like everyone else, with no details about what had been discovered. The Vryn delegation arrived shortly after, Ambassador Vex leading his officers with his usual aggressive confidence. The chamber filled quickly. Representatives from all 12 species took their positions. The mood was tense. Emergency sessions were rare, usually called only for genuine crises. The Quellan administrator, a tall being named Protocon, stood at the central podium. His face, normally calm and neutral, showed signs of distress. Quellans did not like disorder, and what he had discovered was deeply disorderly. "Members of the council," Protocon began, his voice carrying through the chamber. "I have called this emergency session because of a discovery made during routine archival review. What I found is deeply troubling and requires immediate attention." Vex shifted in his seat. "What sort of discovery?" he demanded. "Why the drama, Administrator?" "Last night, our automated backup systems captured and archived a data transmission," Protocon explained. This transmission contained documents that appear to show a coordinated effort to fabricate evidence against the human delegation. The room erupted. Multiple delegates began speaking at once. Morrison stood, his face carefully neutral but his eyes sharp. Vex rose as well, his scales darkening with anger. "This is absurd," Vex declared. "Obviously, human intelligence has planted something in your systems to discredit us. This entire session is a farce." Protocon raised his hand for silence. When the room quieted, he continued. "I understand your concern, Ambassador Vex. I had the same thought initially. However, I have spent the night reviewing the technical logs with my most trusted engineers. The transmission did not originate from human systems. It originated from Vryn communication equipment." He activated the chamber's main display. Technical data appeared, showing transmission logs, routing information, and encryption signatures. To anyone with knowledge of network systems, it was damning evidence. The files were encrypted using VRIN military protocols. Protocon continued. However, due to what appears to be a hardware failure in your quantum key generator, the encryption degraded during transmission. Our systems were able to capture and archive the readable data. More displays appeared, showing the fabricated documents that Danny had captured days ago. Communications designed to look like they came from Earth. Military plans that humans had never made. Intelligence reports that painted humanity as aggressive and dangerous. This is impossible, Vex protested. But his voice had lost some of its confidence. Our encryption is flawless. This must be some kind of technical manipulation. I have reviewed every aspect of the system, Protocon said firmly. The quantum key generator in your communication room shows signs of component degradation. This is a known failure mode for that type of equipment. There is no evidence of tampering. This was a hardware failure, pure and simple. Danny, watching from above, had to admire the Quellen's thoroughness. Protocon had done exactly what Danny had hoped. He had investigated the technical aspects completely, found the natural-looking failure, and reached the conclusion that the evidence was legitimate. The Tlaxian ambassador stood, his expression troubled. These documents show communications with my delegation. They suggest we had agreed to join a coalition against humanity. I want to state clearly that while we have had concerns about human expansion, we have never agreed to any coordinated action. If these communications claim otherwise, they are false. Other ambassadors began speaking up. The pattern became clear quickly. The VRIN had been conducting a sophisticated disinformation campaign, manufacturing evidence and building a coalition through deception. The fabricated documents were detailed enough that it was obvious this had been planned for months. Morrison finally spoke, his voice calm, but firm. This explains a great deal. We have been confused by the level of hostility we have faced in these negotiations. Accusations have been made that did not match our understanding of the situation. Now we see why. The VRIN have been poisoning the well, creating false evidence to turn other species against humanity. Vex stood again, his massive frame intimidating even in defeat. You cannot prove we created these documents. For all we know, the humans created them to make us look guilty. Then explain the transmission logs, Protocon said. Explain why these files originated from your equipment. Explain why the quantum key generator in your communication room failed at precisely the time this transmission occurred. Vex had no answer. He looked at his officers, but they had nothing to offer. The technical evidence was too solid. The Quellens were known for their precision and neutrality. If Protocon said the files came from VRIN systems, then they came from VRIN systems. The chamber descended into chaos. Delegates who had been sympathetic to the VRIN position began distancing themselves quickly. No one wanted to be associated with such blatant deception. The carefully built coalition was collapsing in real time. Through it all, Danny continued his work in the gallery. He adjusted a climate control unit. He replaced a burnt-out indicator light. He was completely ignored. Just another maintenance worker doing his job while history unfolded below. Morrison let the chaos build for several minutes before speaking again. I propose, he said, his voice cutting through the noise, that we use this unfortunate incident as an opportunity. Clearly, the current diplomatic framework has vulnerabilities. Species can operate in bad faith, manufacture evidence, and manipulate others. We need better protocols, better verification systems, better transparency. He outlined a new framework for diplomatic interaction, requirements for third-party verification of sensitive information, neutral oversight of communications, regular audits by Quellen administrators to ensure accuracy and honesty. The other species, embarrassed by how easily they had been manipulated, found themselves nodding along. Morrison was offering them a way to save face while also ensuring this could not happen again. It was brilliant diplomacy. The VRIN, meanwhile, were isolated and exposed. Vex tried to argue, but his position was untenable. The evidence was clear. The other species were turning against him. Finally, with no other option, he agreed to withdraw the VRIN fleet from the neutral zone and accept a formal censure from the Council. It was a complete reversal from just days earlier. The VRIN had come to the station expecting to intimidate humanity into accepting restrictions. Instead, they were leaving in disgrace while humanity gained new diplomatic protections. The session ended with agreements to implement Morrison's framework. Species that had been hostile to Earth just hours earlier were now eager to be seen as cooperative and transparent. The whole political landscape had shifted. As the delegates filed out, several approached Morrison to discuss the new protocols in detail. They praised his diplomatic skill, his calm response to the Vryn deception, his constructive proposal for reform. Morrison accepted the praise graciously, but his eyes briefly flickered to the technical gallery where Danny was packing up his tools. It was the briefest glance, gone in an instant, but Danny saw it. A silent acknowledgement between two professionals who understood their roles. Danny made his way through the service corridors back to his quarters. His mission was complete. The Vryn conspiracy had been exposed. Humanity had gained significant advantages in the diplomatic arena, and no one suspected that a maintenance worker had orchestrated the entire thing. He filed his final maintenance reports, documenting all the work he had done over the past week. Repairs to environmental systems, replacement of worn components, preventive maintenance on critical systems. A perfect record of a competent, unremarkable technician. 3 days later, Danny left the diplomatic station on a commercial transport. His assignment was over. He would return to Earth, debrief with Colonel Hayes, and eventually receive another mission. Another cover identity, another invisible role, another chance to protect humanity from threats that no one else saw coming. The transport was crowded with travelers from various species. Danny sat in a middle row, looking out the window at the station receding in the distance. A human passenger sat down next to him, a young woman who looked like she might be a student or researcher. "Were you on the station during that whole diplomatic incident?" she asked, making conversation. "I was there," Danny replied, "but I am just maintenance staff. I mostly kept to myself. Still, must have been exciting. They say Commander Morrison handled the whole thing brilliantly. Did you see him?" "A few times," Danny said. "He seemed very professional. I would love to meet him someday," the woman said. "He is becoming quite famous back on Earth, a real hero." Danny smiled slightly. "I am sure he would appreciate that." They talked a bit more about mundane topics before the woman pulled out a book and began reading. Danny closed his eyes and rested. Let Morrison have the fame and medals. Let the historians write about his... 6 months after the diplomatic station incident, Danny sat in a small restaurant in Seattle, eating lunch and watching the rain fall outside. He was on leave between assignments, enjoying a rare moment of being himself, rather than whatever cover identity his work required. The restaurant was quiet, just a few other customers scattered at various tables. The news screen on the wall was showing a report about Commander Morrison. He had been promoted to admiral and was now leading a new diplomatic initiative with 3 species that had previously been hostile to Earth. The reporter called him a master strategist, a man who had single-handedly shifted the balance of galactic politics in humanity's favor. Danny smiled and took another bite of his sandwich. Morrison deserved the recognition. He had played his role perfectly, drawing attention and making the moves that everyone could see. The fact that those visible moves had been supported by invisible operations was something the public did not need to know. A woman slid into the seat across from Danny. He looked up, recognizing Colonel Hayes immediately despite her civilian clothes. She had aged in the years since she started the Gray Man protocol, her hair now showing streaks of gray. But her eyes were as sharp as ever. "Thought I might find you here," Hayes said. "You always did like this place." "The sandwiches are good," Danny replied. "And it is quiet." "What brings you to Seattle, Colonel?" "You, actually. I wanted to talk to you in person rather than through secure channels." Danny set down his food, giving her his full attention. Hayes did not make social calls. If she had come to see him personally, it was important. "The Gray Man protocol is expanding," Hayes said. "The success of your mission at the diplomatic station proved the value of our approach. Command wants to increase our numbers from 30 operatives to over 100. We are going to be recruiting and training a whole new generation." "That is good news," Danny said. "We can cover more territory, handle more situations." "It is good news," Hayes agreed. "But it also presents challenges. When the program was small, we could select very carefully. We could find people with the right temperament, the right skills, the right mindset. With rapid expansion, that becomes harder. I am concerned about maintaining our standards." She pulled out a tablet and slid it across the table. Danny picked it up and scrolled through the documents displayed on the screen. They were training proposals, Organizational structures, evaluation criteria for new recruits. You want me to help develop the training program, Danny said, understanding. More than that. I want you to lead it. You are the most successful operative we have. You understand what it takes to operate at the highest level. I want you to train the next generation. Teach them what you know, help them develop the skills they need. Danny set down the tablet and looked out the window. The rain was steady now, turning the street outside into a blur of gray and reflected light. He thought about what Hayes was asking. It meant coming out of the field at least partially. It meant sharing what he had learned, codifying techniques that he had developed through years of practice. You would still take assignments, Hayes added, but between missions you would work with recruits. Help them learn. Make sure they understand that this is not about glory or recognition. It is about doing what needs to be done even when no one is watching. What about the expansion, though? Danny asked. 100 operatives is a significant increase. Can we really maintain operational security with that many people? That is part of why I need you, Hayes said. You understand the risks. You can help us design structures that keep operatives isolated enough that if one is compromised, it does not bring down the whole network. We need to build in redundancy and protection. Danny considered this. The Gray Man protocol had been effective precisely because it was small and carefully managed. Expansion brought new capabilities but also new vulnerabilities. They would need to be smart about how they grew. There is another reason I want you in this role, Hayes continued. You have become something of a legend in the intelligence community. People do not know your name, but they know there is someone out there who has pulled off multiple impossible missions. That mystery, that reputation, it helps in recruiting. When candidates learn they might be trained by the operative behind the diplomatic station's success, it motivates them. They do not need to know it was me specifically, Danny said. No, they do not, Hayes agreed. And we would not tell them. But the training cadre would know. The senior staff would know. Having you in that role adds credibility to the program. It shows that we take training seriously, that we put our best people into developing the next generation. A waiter approached to refill their water glasses. Both Danny and Hayes went silent until he left. It was instinctive, the habit of not discussing sensitive topics around others. Even here in a random Seattle restaurant, they maintained operational discipline. After the waiter left, Danny spoke again. What about Morrison? Does he know about my role in the diplomatic station incident? He suspects, Hayes said. He is not stupid. He knows that the technical failure that exposed the Vren was too convenient to be purely accidental. But he does not know who you are or what organization you work for. As far as he is concerned, someone in human intelligence made it happen. That is all he needs to know. Danny nodded. That was the way it should be. Morrison operated in the visible world of official diplomacy. Danny operated in the invisible world of covert operations. The two worlds needed to remain separate for both to function effectively. I will do it, Danny said finally. I will lead the training program. But I want to make sure we do not lose what makes the protocol effective. We need to stay focused on quality over quantity. Agreed, Hayes said. That is exactly why I want you in charge. Write up your thoughts on maintaining standards. Design the evaluation process you think we need. I will give you a lot of authority to shape this program. They talked for another hour about the specifics. Danny would finish his current leave period and then report to a new training facility that was being built in Montana, remote, isolated, perfect for teaching people how to be invisible. He would have a staff of instructors working under him, most of them former field operatives themselves. The work would be different from field operations, but Danny found himself looking forward to it. He had spent years being invisible, moving through the galaxy as someone no one noticed. Teaching others to do the same felt like a natural evolution. After Hayes left, Danny remained in the restaurant, finishing his meal and thinking about the future. The Gray Man Protocol had started as an experimental idea, a response to humanity's early failures in galactic diplomacy. Now it was becoming a cornerstone of Earth's intelligence operations. His phone buzzed with a message. It was from a friend he had served with in Special Forces years ago, before he joined the Gray Man program. The message was casual, asking if Danny wanted to meet up for drinks while he was in town. Danny sent back a polite decline, saying he had family obligations. It was a lie, but a necessary one. His old military friends thought he had gone into civilian life, working as an engineer or technician somewhere boring. They had no idea he was still in service, conducting operations that shaped galactic politics. That separation was hard sometimes. Danny had missed weddings and funerals, had lost touch with people who had once been close friends. The price of being invisible was that you had to maintain that invisibility in all aspects of life. You could not be a secret operative in the field and then a social butterfly at home. The risk of exposure was too great. But Danny had made peace with that sacrifice years ago. Some people protected humanity by standing in the spotlight, being generals and diplomats and public figures. Others protected humanity by working in shadows, doing things that could never be acknowledged or celebrated. Both roles were necessary. Both roles were honorable. Danny had chosen his path and had never regretted it. He paid his bill and left the restaurant, walking through the rain without an umbrella. The water soaked his jacket, but he did not mind. There was something cleansing about rain, something that washed away the accumulated weight of hidden identities and secret missions. Tomorrow he would start preparing for his new role. He would begin designing training programs, developing evaluation criteria, thinking about how to teach people the art of being invisible. But today, for a few more hours, he was just Danny Cole, walking through his hometown, being himself. A year later, the first class of new Gray Man operatives completed their training. 20 recruits had started the program and 12 had made it through. The attrition rate was high, but that was by design. This work was not for everyone. It required a specific temperament, a willingness to accept that your greatest successes would never be recognized. Danny had been demanding as an instructor. He pushed the recruits hard, testing not just their technical skills but their psychological resilience. Could they maintain a cover identity for months without breaking character? Could they watch others take credit for their work without feeling resentment? Could they make the sacrifices this life required? Those who made it through were transformed. They had arrived as eager volunteers, excited about becoming spies. They graduated as something different, quieter, more patient, more comfortable with anonymity. They